recording. My favorite thing, because then you know it's happening. There's no like, oops, my finger slipped. So, um, well, I'm Sadie Ward. I started the Minneapolis chapter of the Green Theater Alliance. Welcome, everyone. I kind of know both of you, so that's more for the YouTube channel aspect of it. But Craig and Luke, I don't think you two know each other.
No, we don't. I don't
No.
think so.
Yeah. Do you want
Hi,
to just
Luke.
do like your own brief intro and
Hey.
maybe like what you're kind of interested in Green Theater then?
Yeah, my name's Luke. I'm a assistant professor of theater at the University of Minnesota Morris. And we do a fair amount of green theater practices as a campus as a whole. And as well as our program as well does a lot of green theater practices and tries to encapsulate how we can do green theater into our curriculum, which we have a few classes where we do kind of costume design with reclaimed materials and things like that.
Great, and I'm Craig Johnson, he, him, and I am a freelance director and actor around in the Twin Cities, and I'm also teaching directing at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I'm just interested in this generally as a topic, and in fact, earlier today, I was talking with the folks who operate Shakespearean Youth Theater in St. Paul. They've been doing some visioning work on what's the next chapter for them and how do they move forward. And so I was just talking about green theater practices with them. Do they need bricks and mortar? Do they need a new building, or do they need more of a flexible space? So it was just on my mind, and I had a free evening, so here I am.
Excellent. We do have scheduled later kind of like a directing specific topic. But one thing that kind of strikes me as a commonality between you two right now is the fact that you are both professors and just how that also intersects with green choices. So I don't have too many, structured questions. They're kind of big open-ended questions to just kind of get some conversation going. So I'm just kind of curious, maybe Craig, to hear a little bit more from you kind of as a professor and as a director, just kind of like where you're at with it in terms of like, do you feel like you're like really grounded in like a point of view, or is there something that like the Green Theater Alliance could do to help give you tools to kind of bring things into the community as a director and as a professor as well?
Oh, thanks for that invitation. I feel like I should have something more profound to say, but it's really just, it's something that I'm interested in and have growing passion for as we approach, a climate crisis that we exist, and my awareness that I live and work in an art form, we all do, that I feel like is one of the most negatively impactful of all art forms. I can't think of anything else other than theater that I feel like uses so much embodied energy or actual energy. And I just think of all the shows that I've done where at the end of the day, at the end of the show, the only thing you have is an overflowing dumpster, and I just keep thinking there has to be a better way, and we have to be able to teach people better practices around that. So I really came to listen more than anything. And well, here's two other thoughts. One is I'm a big advocate of what Michelle Hensley has created with 10,000 Things Theater Company in terms of something that's really light on its feet and leaves a very small carbon footprint. She's of course no longer with 10,000 Things, but they're continuing that work. So I think that's really interesting. I'm also serve on the board of a rural Iowa summer stock theater called Cedar Summer Stock. And we do 4 musicals each summer. We're going into our 5th season. I'm on the board, and in the past seasons, I've directed 1 or 2 shows there. And I think particularly musical theater has a really strong negative impact upon the environment, just because they tend to be such big shows with a lot of people in them, that they have like a lot of sets and a lot of costumes and just a lot of stuff in there. And everyone's all mic'd, and we just get, and the idea
Batteries.
that we just can't think of another way to present musical theater other than that, how could we
Mhm.
possibly? So I'm interested in hearing ways that other people might be exploring, particularly that branch of theater.
Well, I'm all for not miking. Let me tell you that right now. But
Yeah.
um, just well, just because there's always issues, and I'm the one that fixes the issues. But yeah, no, I would agree with you. It's like musicals, just, and not to dump on them, but I'm gonna, like, is that they really eat a lot of, they eat a lot of time, energy, money, and like, yeah, it's like, especially like, I have memory of doing Brigadoon in graduate school, and us getting a 10-yard dumpster and just filling it, because it was like such a specific show that it's not like reusable or anything like that, and we didn't have the room for it, and it's just it's all this. And that's, it's so funny because I just kind of hit my mind that, if you think about like the 40, the classic American musical, it's like, oh God, those are big sets. Compared to, a
Yeah.
lot of sets now are a lot more unit based and things like that, which less waste. But I typically say it's like a unit set makes a foundation and the lights fill in all the cracks.
Right. We have 3 times as many lights now, it
Mhm.
feels like, for most shows. Anyway,
Oh
go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry, I didn't
absolutely.
mean to interrupt. Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
just and since I guess it's about lighting, I can, the biggest thing that we're really concerned with at Morris right now is just like, when I'm getting new equipment and things like that, is just thinking about e-waste. Like, it's just improving equipment, and then it's like, well, I can't really recycle old LEDs, really. It's just trying to think of long-term solutions instead of short-term has been something that we've been struggling with.
Mhm. Sometimes, because I think one thing that you brought up, Craig, that I'm also really curious and just exploring further, and I think Luke, you mentioned like Brigadoon being so specific.
Mhm.
I think back to like it feels like a million years ago now when I took theater history in undergrad, but like the idea of like the progression of design historically, because like sets used to be pretty generic, like they weren't so design specific, or so like show specific. And then like over probably like the last century or so, like shows became much more specific. And I think it's really interesting that we're talking about musicals, and especially in the 1940s as well, because that's when I think like, because it's like musical theater history, there's like pre-Oklahoma and post-Oklahoma, and I bet if you like started a like chart, you could probably like track out like these are the shows that like start to really have like really specific show designs as well. And so it's just kind of like I think about that too as a designer, of like I think part of it is like you have to like start to think, like you have to start the conversation at the production meeting too, to like really understand like what is actually like really needed to tell this story. And that's where I think like directors have such a powerful influence on this as a vision, that sometimes, because like I've thought about this a lot in the pandemic too, right? When you have a year and a half to not do your art form, it gives you a lot of time to think about your art form. um and I've thought, because like there was a period of time where I was like, I don't think I can do theater if it's so wasteful and this is something that's so important to me. And then I just kind of like made a decision at one point where I was just like, well, I'm just going to try and be the designer that just does green shows, and that's just like
Mhm.
something I want to try. So that's like, as a designer, I'm trying to like start the conversation with directors, but at the end of the day, they're the director, right? And like there's a certain kind of give and take to that. But I do think that directors have a lot of influence over how we can start to visually think of these worlds differently too. So
I think you're absolutely right that it sort of does start with the director. Um, I would really appreciate, like, when I go into like a kickoff meeting for a show and I talk about like my favorite aspect of minimalism, of just like wanting just enough tech to make the show sing, but to recognize that theater, the essential elements of actor, author, audience, and whatever place, arena that you're in, if you want 4 A's for that, uh,
Mhm.
it doesn't really include the director or the design team. They're a little bit on the outside. And if I had a designer who came in and said that, that they prefer to work that way, I always feel like if I say that to a designer, I'm dissing them, or or some undercutting their contributions, which I don't mean to do. It's not my intent at all. But if I heard from a designer that just from a green standpoint, an environmental stance, that they would prefer to design more minimally, I would just be in heaven
Yeah.
to hear that.
And I think you're kind of on the front. I appreciate you saying that too, because it's like, I definitely have had those same conversations where it's like, no, it's not like minimal doesn't necessarily mean less. I mean, it does in a tangible sense, but not in an artistic sense.
Yeah.
And so that's something, it's like, if you make this big open space, a big minimalist set, don't weigh it down with props then, or don't weigh it down with costumes, things like that. It's just, and that's something that, I always try and, stress is like, smaller scale down productions don't necessarily mean it's not as much. It's just, you have to be more specific with your choices, which is actually a bigger challenge anyway.
Right.
I would agree with that, because I think as a designer, I think of the times like some of my most creative things have come out of like my really low budget things, right? Like
Mhm.
I don't have a budget, so I'm gonna go like kidnap a deck that was torn down and use that for my platforming, things like that, and it ends up being like beautiful. But I think sometimes when you're given so many infinite possibilities, it kind of like waters down like what the story actually is, because there's just so much stuff that you're not actually like prioritizing things to actually like effectively tell the story.
Oh yeah, and that's I keep trying to bring this back to lightings. That's our theme, but that's like, I was on a panel with a few other professors last March about like how LED technology, be it's great, but then also now I can hand over, because we're all LED at our theater. I can be like, okay, any color you want, just click around. Um, and so it's this idea of still having to make specific choices and justifying them. Because before it was like, okay, if you want to change the color, you gotta go get the 16-foot ladder with the wooden dipstick in the center and pull it up and change the gel if you want. And it's like, so if you don't really want to do that as often, so you have to be more specific with your choices. And now it's like, oh, just click around the color selector and pick a different color. So it's just, it's there's this fine line. But going back to what you were saying about like how there's so many options, like just today I had in my set design class, we put scale models in a light lab that I built, and students didn't know what to do, and I was like, just start with one thing, because I was like, one light will be more evocative than a dozen, right? And like that's the thing, is scaling back, I think, is something that we forget about, how minimalist, like even a minimal lighting design with minimal fixtures can create really evocative things.
Mm-hmm.
Craig, I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious in your experience, like freelance directing, just like from a lighting standpoint, kind of specifically. I'm not familiar with some of the venues that you've worked at, but how many venues have you worked at that like have LED lights at this point that can be part of the conversation? Just as a going out in the world, can I even
Right.
expect to like have that kind of conversation around LED lights?
I work at a lot of different places, at a lot of different venues, and sort of going from educational and small to medium-sized professional. And I think all of them have a mix of light, so they're moving towards LED, but there's a lot of other older stuff. that's
I
there.
would say by and large, the Minneapolis theater scene is mixed.
Yep.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think of, it's actually like for us, for me to say that our program's all LED is actually quite still very rare, I think.
Yeah.
I've just been able to wrestle some green energy grants.
Good
But
for you.
well, it was like we were doing a meter of the power of the building. I was like, let me turn my stage lights on. They went boop. Uh, but yeah, it's even just thinking about, but the other thing too is there's something to be said too about like Latte Da and like the Southern and stuff. They have a lot of older fixtures, but it's not, that doesn't mean they're bad, A, and B, you can keep, they still have them because you can easily fix them.
Yep.
Like I can't fix my LED lights. Right. I just can't, I'll have to ship it out. So that kind of knowledge that worries me because that's kind of disappearing a little bit of just like, I could bring back a stage light, an incandescent stage light back to life pretty, unless it was completely destroyed, you can bring those back to life at least a little bit. But you can't, once an LED's broke, it's broke.
And we know just from that aspect, the embodied energy in a new lighting fixture versus using the same one and just repairing it once again, just on our scale of being green, that puts in a lot of other factors there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I've never thought about how if an LED light breaks, like what do you do with it? So I was just like,
there's
obviously LED
There's
is
certain
just
things you can
better.
do, but not a lot,
Yeah. So
it literally is, they don't make them like they used to. It's literally that case. That's the case.
Have either of you, what have you learned during the pandemic, just in terms of needing to do more theater that might be outside, where lighting issues suddenly become quite different?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I did a show outside this past summer. I did a Shakespeare in the Park, and that's one thing about with LEDs. It was a lot easier. We didn't have to pull. I didn't have to pull out a gas generator to power stage lights. I was able to just do regular, just run extension cables because the power draw was not near as bad. And that's one thing that's really nice about it. But doing it outside in terms of green theater too is also a way of kind of keeping all the designers kind of humble, because it's like, how much do you want to haul in and out if it rains?
Oh,
yeah. The Sustainable Production Toolkit, actually, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, Craig. I've posted it on the Facebook page with the Green Theater Alliance. It's a really well put together PDF. I really recommend reviewing it. But site-specific performances are actually one thing that they recommend for making less material choices. And I also think too, like some of the shows that I saw this summer, because like I would not have considered myself an outdoor theater person prior to the pandemic. I was like, no, theater is inside. I sit in a dark little theater. That's what I do. But I think kind of to reiterate what Luke said, I remember I saw Pangea's production of The Water Walk, and I was like super impressed with the sound. Because like with outdoor theater, I was like very much so expecting to like not hear half the show, but the sound was so well done. And I asked the stage manager afterwards, I was like, how did you do that sound? And she was like, well, we had to like haul it in and haul it out every single night. And I'm like, that's remarkable. So I think it's like super true what you're saying about like doing an outdoor production, I think can really humble you. And I think it gets back to kind of like what we were saying about it, like really makes you make choices about like what is the story that we're actually telling, because that's also something that I think about sometimes too. I remember like the first production where like I was like in tech, and it was like a very like I was doing props for it, and it was a very prop heavy show, and I just like had this moment where I was just like, I don't know why I'm telling this story, and I was just like already upset that the tech was what the tech was. And then like having this realization, like looking back on it, like it was such a pivotal like production for me to really be like, I don't know why I as a designer am doing this show because I don't even like this play. I don't know why I'm doing this and putting myself through it. So I think it's sometimes I wonder if you have to almost like go through experiences like that to then like remember it, to be like, why am I telling this story? Like,
But
why
how quickly do we forget too?
that
Right.
show I never forgot, but that's maybe just me.
But
So
Luke, I'm reminded of your production of Brigadoon that you were talking
Yeah.
about too, you know, where you have this huge dumpster full of stuff and you realize, what do you have at the end of the day? Well, we did Brigadoon. I mean,
Yeah.
not to diss on it, but you know.
Oh no, please do. Please do.
You know, somewhat a charming second rate
We were trying to do a classic, and it's just what we
right, right.
but yeah, it's just, it's so specific. Like, we're not going to need this set again.
Well, you know, we know perfectly well from theater history that our greatest pinnacles of dramatic art came from outdoor theaters where there was no additional lighting other than daylight, you know, and we told the stories very, very simply in ancient Greece and Elizabethan England, you know, and even in 19th century Europe and the United States, you know, I think as you were saying, you know, I mean, we had like roll drop sets, you know, that were just painted backgrounds right there. That was plenty. That was
Yeah.
plenty to tell the story.
It was basically, you had your Rolodex of drops. You know, like, here's our city drop, here's our forest drop, here's our
Yeah.
castle. Boom. What else do you need?
Right. And especially for something like Brigadoon, you know, give us that illustrated storybook charm right there, which is what that show trades on, you know, and let us use our imagination after that. So
What was
the
it?
more we could lean into that, I think the better productions we'd have of Brigadoon.
Well, I'm just thinking of now I'm just trying to think of like all the stupid stuff I've built for like a 30-second scene. Like in Mary Poppins, when they put the evil nanny in a bird cage I was like, why did we just build a giant bird cage to put her in? We
It's
literally
always
roll it
like-
on and roll it off.
it's always those just like boop and then pull it off with a stick or whatever.
It's like,
So-
why are we choosing to die on this hill? But we do.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the thing about props though too, Sadie, is like, I always just feel like props end up, every time I do props for a show, I'm always like, God, why am I buying so much shit? Like, and it's like, oh, I better get 2 different ones just in case.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just like, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's just an observation of me being grumpy.
Yeah.
But I definitely have wasted a lot of money, time, and resources on like plastic stuff on props. I'm just like, ugh.
Yeah.
Craig, I'm also kind of curious because I think as we're having this conversation of like more minimal choices, like a question that comes up is how will the audience react to these choices? So I'm just kind of curious from like a directing standpoint to just kind of get your thoughts on, because like I've always thought of the director as like the director is supposed to like be understanding, like, you know, thinking of the audience and like how these things will land. So I'm just kind of curious how you maybe kind of keep that balance in your mind while you're going through like conversations with your designers as well, of, you know, because you initially said, you know, you don't want to offend your designer, but then there's also the audience too. So
Right.
like you're ultimately balancing the most expectations in a lot of ways.
I'm currently working on a production of A Christmas Carol at Commonweal Theater in Lanesboro, Minnesota, where we have our big twist on it is we have a female Scrooge. So we've rewritten it from a woman's point of view, you know, trying to use as much of the original language. So we have a female Scrooge, a female Marley as characters played by women. And the 3 spirits are also played by women. Justin Hooper, who's at Concordia University, who I've worked with a lot, is the scenic designer. He originally came in with like 2 turntables which sort of makes sense, because you go to a lot of different locations initially. But I gently rejected that just for something simpler, because of course, with any production of Christmas Carol, you're always doing so much of Dickens' wonderful narration. So you're just doing storytelling with dramatized scenes within that. So we went to something much simpler that we're doing. And even just today, we were trading emails about like, how can we take like the number of sittable units, crates, stools, and chairs, and how can we boil it down to even fewer?
Mhm.
I think we've gotten it down to 11 units, which seems like way too many because we never need that many on stage, but just from Fezziwigs to Fred's house to the Cratchits, to Scrooge's, it's just like, okay, I guess we have to have that many. Anyway, so it's just been a continual sort of negotiation in that project to like get as few as possible and still feel we have enough bells and whistles and cool things that will happen, like we'll use the trap. So one of the spirits will come up from underneath the stage and stuff like that. So we'll use just what's there in the space. So that's how I'm thinking of like, the audience will be entranced by the story because it is just an entrancing story. They'll be hooked in because it's a female Scrooge. So they'll be continually reevaluating. It's just like, well, does that work in that time period? What do I think about that now? And just relying on the strength of the storytelling to do that. And I think it's going to carry us through.
Mhm.
I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's the show. Those are the issues that I'm dealing with day by day right now, in terms of just like scaling it back, scaling it back, scaling it back. How simple can it be, but can we still make it evocative enough? Knowing that always in the back of my head, I'm thinking we are like the counterweight to Guthrie magic, which is the spectacle Christmas Carol.
Well, at least they, that one too, is at least it's the same set every year though, too.
Yeah.
Except this year, it's going to be a new set.
Yeah, I saw that. Is it projected?
I am not certain, actually. I've got tickets.
So is that set just going to sit in that semi trailer all winter?
I am not 100% certain what has been decided about that piece yet. I know we got a couple of donations with Next Stage from the old Christmas Carol set already. So if anyone would like to rent them, they will be available in January. So,
well, what's interesting with your question too about the audience, and it's like, not to poo-poo theater people or anything, but I've never walked out of a show and someone's been like, "Oh my God, the set was so small." Like a general.
Absolutely right, Lucas. Totally. Yeah.
A general audience member isn't gonna. I mean, theater people notice, right? But like, it's what we do. It's what we. It's like I can't like, I'll watch shows now, but I just look at stuff, right? But no one's like, yeah, Joe or Sally audience members not gonna be like, oh my God, did you see how big, like, if the set's enormous, what's one thing, but no one's ever like, oh my, such a minimalist set, ugh.
Yeah. And some of it is, if you're standing in for the audience, of taking a look at like, what does that show need to make it work? Is the storytelling strong enough, or does it rely on outstanding acting like a great realistic piece might? Or when does it need scenic elements, or can it just be done with lights, or can we do it simply? I mean, weirdly, I'm always going back to these days to Aristotle about like, just the basic, like all plays have plot, character, theme, language, and spectacle. Spectacle is the least important, and that's all of the scenic elements of just reminding myself and reminding the team about that, and of just like leaning into that and saying like, okay, those other things need to be able to carry the day, but it just needs enough support to float it as a theatrical idea. So it needs the gesture and it needs the idea, but it doesn't need, I think we just have to get away from trying to compete with film, video, television whenever possible, and feeling like we don't need that much to be effective in theater, especially in the regional context that we're operating in.
Mm.
And especially, I think, in the university setting, where sometimes we have more resources to do more of that, and we want to give students the experience of working with all of those things. But that's not what they're going to get when they graduate, and they end up at at the Minnesota Fringe Festival or the Bryant Lake Bowl trying to put something on.
Well, yeah, no, I agree. That's one of the things too, is we is actively, at least from a pedagogical standpoint too, is like resources. Well, we're always balancing, can we, should we, just because we can, should we, right? Like, do we really need projections in this just because we can have projections in this? Or just, that goes into a whole other, I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but like, just because the design team likes it or wants it doesn't mean you should. But yeah, about that's one of the things is like, I try and preach and teach really hard is, having kind of scaled down unit sets and things like that. Cause I was like, once you graduate from one of the U campuses, it's like, it's great. I'll help you out no matter what I can do. But at the same time, when you go do a show at like at any of our smaller regional theaters in Minneapolis, it's like, we got to do what you got to do, and you have to be able to adapt. Especially now with COVID too, especially trying to scale down productions a little bit so we can, like, if someone gets knocked out, we can easily fill in the cracks, right? And it's been an interesting kind of, I don't know, process with that, and how we're trying to manage workflow more, like, specifically, so we don't have to like be like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? This person's gone.
Yeah.
Trying to avoid, I'm sure, Craig, you have had these experiences. You walk into a theater and someone's like, oh my God, thank God you're here. No one knows how to fix this. Or like, well, sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now. But.
One thing I'm interested in exploring a little bit more, because Craig, you mentioned that you did Christmas Carol, but you wrote Scrooge as a female role. And I think we've talked a little bit about Brigadoon and it being a classic. I'm just kind of curious, like, this mentality of like, well, it's a classic, so it's supposed to be done this way. Just like exploring that a little bit more, because I think you were alluding to how, because it's like a female Scrooge, you might be listening differently, which I know when the Guthrie that first year did the understudy with Charity Jones, I know I noticed myself like literally hearing the lines differently, because I was like, oh, it's a woman saying it and I'm a woman hearing it and I'm hearing this differently because of the way this gender dynamic is happening.
Right.
But I'm just kind of curious, is it something where we always have to have like some kind of other choice at like the center of the plot to like drive some of those like minimal choices so that we're listening to just that choice? Or can it just be a classic that has the minimal choices? Does that make sense, what I just said?
It sure does, yeah. And of course the classics can and almost should have that, because they were written that way. I mean, they were written to be that way. I mean, everything up until late 19th century was all minimalist.
Mm-hmm.
There was no electric lighting, of course, there was no recorded sound. There were really simple sets, if there were any at all, and just a few props. So we know the greatest theater in the world can happen almost without those things, or with very minimal kind of stuff. And even if you look at, I don't know what the original production photos of Brigadoon might reveal too. How odd that we're talking about Brigadoon.
I know, we've talked about it. I haven't talked about it in years, and now it's like,
well, it's because everyone kind of like knows
Express?
what you're talking about, though. Starlight
Right.
Express.
Yeah. So that's a good reason to do that. But like there is a film version of the original London production of South Pacific, pretty much the same time, from the original London production. And it is not elaborate. It's not at all elaborate. It's really quite simple. And most of those Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals, it's just like Oklahoma just has 3 scenes in a super long act 1,
Mm-hmm.
So it's very minimalist. It's almost like a play with music in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
You just don't need a lot to.
It's just like you could do Picnic in Oklahoma in the same season. You just take one house off.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
Oh my God, that's what we're doing next year. Okay.
Backyard plays. Yeah. Backyard countries plays.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. Well, yeah, I don't. It's interesting thinking about. Well, yeah, it's interesting. We talk about like spoken decor with Victorian drama and things like that, and everyone just had their Rolodex of things that this is. I was just watching. We were just showing a documentary in my design class about how like everyone did thunder the same way. Everyone just had bowling balls rolling across the attic of the theater. Not bowling balls, cannonballs. They didn't have bowling balls in Victorian theater, but like that's just how we did it. And it was interesting though is that so different theaters are developing different methods on how to do thunder with cannonballs rolling across these gutters in their ceiling, and that's where the term "stealing one's thunder" came from, because they're stealing each other's ideas. That doesn't need it's nothing to do with green theater. It's just an interesting fact I heard today that I wanted to share.
Right.
So you're gonna have to share which documentary that was, because that sounds kind of interesting.
I'll share it with you on Drive. It's very British and very 70s.
I love it. Yeah. So original practices, just have a lot of revelations for us.
Mhm.
Mhm.
We just forgotten those because we've had so many other toys to play with, and such great competition where theater didn't used to have that kind of competition prior to electronic media in the 1920s, let's say.
It's kind of interesting, like if you're using like the cannonball example of like the idea that like at that point in the time, like that's when they used to say, well, this is the way we've always done it, right? And it's like so forgotten about now. Like I didn't know that. Like it's just so interesting that like we hold on to this idea of like, well, this is the way we've always done it, but it's like not 100 years ago it wasn't, and it probably won't be in another 100 years. So why do you have to hold on to just this one idea right now? It kind of like holds you back in a lot of ways too.
Well, and it's like in 100 years ago, theaters didn't last that long. With people with fires and everything else. Just because we've always, it's it's the same way it goes with just like purchasing, right? From an academic standpoint, purchasing can sometimes be really difficult to buy things green, because especially through a big university like this, like I can't just get $20 from the petty cash drawer and be like, oh my God, there's this person that's selling this cabinet on the side of the street that'd be perfect for the show. There has to be a paper trail and things like that. So oftentimes I have to turn, it's too difficult to try and find something locally or like I could get from somebody, because the paper trail to do that is, especially even like tax exemption and things like that, it gets really tricky. And so sometimes I find myself sometimes getting deterred from, going to the thrift store to get something because it's just going to be too difficult to purchase.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think that's a huge problem with large organizations.
Mm-hmm.
In my time in human resources, I often would like ponder sometimes how, like particularly in HR, a lot of what I did was like working through like inherently a human contrived system to achieve something. And like kind of like what you're saying, like so much effort is put into creating this system to prove something, but then you're like, but what am I actually proving? I'm proving that I can follow this system, but I'm not actually like achieving the actual most efficient thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to have a paper trail to buy that cabinet on the side of the road. So,
Mm-hmm.
but
yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, fun, light topics. I'll change up the question. I think one question that I like to kind of ask in these as well, and I think Luke, I think you answered this one in our last conversation, but if you have a different answer this time,
Oh, I'm sure I should.
So if you, Craig, if you could just like wave a magic wand and like you could just get something that would make making green choices easier, like what would you get? Like what would that look like?
I think I would start from the biggest thing and think about the way theater operates and what the theater needs just in terms of space. Just what was that look like? And this is a little bit of what I was talking about to the folks who run Shakespearean Youth Theater. It's just like, do they need a flexible? I'm so aware that theaters, the bricks and mortar of a theater, are so expensive and such huge elements, and they drive the way we do all of the theater inside of that. Is there a way that we can think about site-specific work? Is there a way that we can think about multiple use spaces? So for them, I was thinking about, can you think about a new space that would serve as a classroom and could serve as a rehearsal space and could serve as a black box flexible theater for yourself? And would it be good enough so that it could be set up so that when you were down and just doing classes and not a show, it could be rented out to other theater groups? So it could be used by other like-minded people. So that's one thing, is just thinking about the big box aspect of theater, that we don't end up with such big behemoths that, especially right now, smaller or medium-sized theaters will just go under because they can't sustain that any longer. And on the flip side of it, then that leads you to thinking about site-specific theater and what are the advantages there. Outdoor theater that we've learned about, again, relearned about during the pandemic. And another area that I don't think anyone has cracked at all that I know of is, how do we make use of enormous amounts of corporate real estate, big, large conference room, huge lobby areas that are dramatic and spectacular, that are heated and air conditioned and have usually some dramatic lighting and stuff like that. And they usually have like a lot of like tables and chairs and stuff like that. Why are those spaces not being used? You know, like by 5 o'clock, they are done with those spaces.
Interesting.
How can they be made available to arts groups as just simply a tax write-off? Those big corporations, they don't need any money from us. They could get a little bit of goodwill publicity and just give those spaces away for the evenings, weekends, when we need to use them.
I was just reading Marat Sade today, and you're just checking all the boxes, right?
You've had a full arc of a day. you got Marat Sade into your day as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so that's what I would do if I could wave my magic wand, is think about the space.
Yeah.
Theater spaces.
I think that's a really interesting way that you have framed it. I think particularly when you're thinking about this conversation through lighting as well, like a lot of your lighting choices are inherently made for you just based on like what building you walk in, which is like such an interest. It's a different like system of choices that you work within compared to like a scenic designer. It's almost like in some ways, like as a lighting designer, by making greener choices, it's almost like you're choosing like which venue to work in. Like I want to work in the venue that has the LED lights, or I want to work in the venue that allows natural lighting, or whatever that may be.
Right.
So, but I've also thought about those downtown corporate spaces, especially like with the pandemic and them like just being so empty. Like
so empty.
And all the lights are on.
And all the lights are on, and it's heated, it's air conditioned, you know, and no one's using it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At least St. Paul, they turn the lights off. How courteous of them. I have a new magic wand one, because last time was me just rambling, I think. I want directors to, I'm not saying all directors are like this, but I want graduate schools that teach directing to change how directors should think about design, because depending on the director, things like that. I think, Craig, you're checking all my boxes, so I'd love to work with you. But like, you know, it's so much easier to just have a lot of stuff, right? It's so much easier to just, I don't want to think of business for this actor. I'll give them something to fidget with their hands. So just thinking about like how, especially, you know, a lot of the graduate school programs now in directing, especially, you know, these are big programs. So if you want this, you can get it, right? So thinking about like, how can they make scaled down decisions that are just as impactful as opposed to, let me get this $10,000 projector out
Right.
that we use once a year. That will be obsolete in 5 years, and then I'll just send it to the U restore and they'll sell it for $20. You know.
I want to go find that for $20. I'm gonna show up on the Thursday to go find that.
It won't work probably, but anyway.
Probably not. But Craig, I'm curious, are there any other topics that you maybe thought we would cover in this conversation that maybe we haven't touched on at this point?
I'd love to hear from Luke if there are ways that he's teaching this to students, not only in the classroom and in productions.
Yeah, I could. How much time you got? Yeah, we do quite a bit actually here. Since I don't know if you're familiar, Morris's mission, we're big on green energy here, like absolutely big on it. And so we have adopted that into the theater program. So we sometimes call it sustainable Shakespeare. So we'll do a Shakespearean show, and we'll do one of Shakespeare's shows, and we'll do it completely out of reclaimed materials, set costumes, things like that. A studio art professor and myself co-teach a class called Fashion Trashin', which is a costume design course based off of reclaimed materials. And I actually, I have a few talks I've done at conferences about how utilizing green theater design practices help students learn a little bit better now in terms of inquiry-based learning. So as opposed to, it's so like, I'm going back to props. I need this prop, I'll Google it and buy it on Amazon. You know, it's super easy to do. It's so tempting to do too, to just get exactly what you need online, right? And actually just today in my set design class, I poured a bunch of garbage on the table, on the shop table, and I said, you have to make a model for Hansel and Gretel. And I read Hansel and Gretel was really cute. But so having them play, right? This big aspect of inquiry-based learning is the road to the end product is what's important, not the product as much. Mm-hmm. So having students bend materials, fold them, alter materials, how can actively participate with materials to create what they need is what I've found helps students out a lot more in an educational setting as green theater, as opposed to like, well, hold on, let me Google water bottles and see. We just did the Wolves, so that's why I have water bottles on my brain, because we bought a lot of water bottles. But this idea of, I'm gonna sound pretty soapboxy here, but like this, we're over testing students, we're over testing high school students, and so when I teach design, especially when I do like really open end, like, okay, here's a pile of burlap, make a dress, or something like that. Me just having an open-ended and like, I don't know what it looks like, you have to figure it out, is sometimes kind of I'm finding is stressing students out a little bit more, as opposed to just like a clearly defined, like, cut this, sew this, tape this, end product.
Yeah.
So I found it really freeing, but I have to explain a lot. Like, this is about play and experimenting, not how am I going to finish this? How am I going to make this? Does that answer your question? I'm sorry, I was rambling.
That was really great. I heard some new words and it gave me some new ideas. So thank you.
Yeah, and I also have recorded talks on this as well. If you
I was gonna say, we'll make sure you get some of his recordings, because I think they're pretty good listens as well. to just kind of steal nuggets from. So,
Great.
Oh, thanks.
so steal nuggets in a positive way.
Yes, absolutely.
But-
But yeah.
Great. Well, this has been a great conversation. I've really appreciated it this evening.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I think we've covered a wide range of topics, so I think I'll kind of do like a last call for any other kind of thoughts or questions on anyone's mind. We're kind of trying to use these conversations to just kind of tease out like what can the Green Theater Alliance do to like, as we move into a new calendar year, since we're such a new organization. We only signed the papers in July saying that we're an organization. But knowing what can the Green Theater Alliance offer, we're trying to pull out some of those tangible things from these conversations as well. So
Right.
yeah. But,
Well, I certainly appreciate just the chance to get together with here we have two people who I'm normally not in conversation with, and just the support of just like hearing those ideas is very stimulating and very helpful to me. So thank you.
great.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right. I'm gonna stop recording.